New Year's Eve 2023 was supposed to be quiet. For most people, it was a night of celebration and fireworks. But for me, it was just another shift behind the wheel. I'm a driver, and I've been doing this job for almost a year now. Bills needed to be paid, and after losing my office job, this was the quickest way to make ends meet. Driving strangers around the city wasn't exactly thrilling, but it gave me time to think, or sometimes too much time to think. I had no idea that night would be one I'd never forget. The city was alive with noise as the countdown to midnight approached. I had just dropped off a couple at a club when a new ride request popped up on my phone. The pickup location was in a quiet neighborhood near the edge of town. I almost declined it. The fare didn't seem worth the drive, but something about it pulled me in. I accepted and started heading over. The area was deserted, and snow had started falling gently, covering the streets in a thin white layer. The streetlights flickered as I pulled up to the house. It was an old, two-story home, dark except for a faint light in one window. I checked the app, but no one came out. I waited a few minutes, glancing at the time. Midnight was only 10 minutes away. I considered canceling the ride when the front door creaked open. A man stepped out slowly, wearing a long coat and a black hat pulled low over his face. His movements were deliberate, almost too calm for someone catching a ride on New Year's Eve. He slid into the back seat without saying a word. "Happy New Year," I said, trying to break the silence. He didn't respond.
Where to?
I asked, glancing at him through the rearview mirror. His face was barely visible in the dim light, but his eyes met mine. There was something off about him, but I couldn't put my finger on it. "Just drive," he finally said, his voice low and hoarse. I hesitated for a moment, then shifted into gear and pulled away from the curb. As I drove through the empty streets, the snow fell harder, and the world outside seemed to blur. The man remained silent, watching the city slip by. The radio crackled, and for a moment I thought I heard someone whisper my name. I turned it off, shaking my head. Must be tired, I thought. The man in the back didn't react. After 20 minutes, we were on the outskirts of the city, where the lights were few and far between. The man finally spoke again. "Stop here." I glanced around. We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dark fields and a line of trees in the distance. "Are you sure?" "There's nothing around here," I said. He nodded, pulling out a few bills and handing them to me. "Keep the change," he muttered. I hesitated but took the money. As he stepped out, he paused, turning his head slightly. "Don't drive back through the forest," he said without explanation. Then he disappeared into the darkness, walking toward the trees. I watched him go, unease settling in my stomach. The snow had stopped and the night was eerily quiet. I decided to ignore his warning and take the forest road back into the city. It was faster, and I was tired. The road twisted through tall, bare trees, their branches stretching out like skeletal fingers. My headlights cut through the dark, but the forest seemed to swallow the light. Halfway through, my car sputtered and the engine died. I groaned, hitting the steering wheel.
Not tonight.
I muttered. I stepped out, shivering as I popped the hood. The cold seeped into my bones. As I inspected the engine, I heard footsteps crunching in the snow behind me. I spun around, flashlight in hand, but saw nothing.
Hello?
I called out, but no one answered. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I hurried back into the car and tried the engine again. It sputtered, and after a few tense seconds, it roared to life. I wasted no time driving out of the forest, heart pounding. When I finally reached the city, I parked under a streetlight and took a deep breath. As I reached for my phone, I noticed something strange. A black hat lay on the passenger seat, the same hat the man had been wearing. I stared at it, heart racing. I hadn't noticed him leaving anything behind. Gripping the hat, I turned it over, and inside, scrawled in faint handwriting, was a single word: midnight. I never drove through that part of town again. And every New Year's Eve since, I make sure to stay off the roads. Some passengers, it seems, never really leave the car. My wife Emily and I had been searching for a fresh start after a difficult year. Financial struggles, the loss of a job, and the constant noise of city living. We needed quiet, space, and most of all, a place where our 6-year-old daughter Mia could feel safe and happy. The house was perfect, a modest, single-story home in a quiet suburb. The backyard was what sold me. It was large, bordered by old oaks and a weathered wooden fence that offered just the right amount of privacy. Emily imagined summer dinners on the patio, and Mia couldn't stop talking about planting flowers in the garden. I saw peace, a place where we could finally breathe. But peace wasn't what we found. It started on the first night. As we unpacked boxes in the living room, Mia played by the sliding glass door that opened to the backyard. She was talking to herself, or so I thought. "Who are you?" she said suddenly, her small voice cutting through the sound of Emily opening boxes. I froze.
Who are you talking to, sweetheart?
She turned and pointed to the backyard. The man by the tree. I walked to the glass door, heart thudding. The yard was empty, bathed in the fading glow of dusk.
There's no one there, Mia.
I said, trying to keep my voice light.
Maybe you saw a shadow.
She frowned but didn't argue. Emily smiled at me, mouthing, "Imagination," and I nodded, pretending to believe it. But I didn't sleep well that night. The next evening was quiet, almost unnervingly so. I was grilling burgers in the backyard while Emily set the table on the patio. Mia played near the garden with her toy train, her giggles occasionally breaking the stillness. That's when I saw him. A figure stood at the edge of the yard, just beyond the fence, partially hidden by the trees. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. "Emily," I called, keeping my eyes on the figure. "Do we have a neighbor who likes to hang out by the fence?" Emily stepped outside, squinting in the direction I was pointing. "I don't see anyone," she said. I blinked, and he was gone. By the time dinner ended, I had convinced myself it was my imagination, or maybe a branch swaying in the breeze. But that night, I woke to the faint sound of footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate. I got out of bed and crept to the sliding glass door. The yard was dark, the trees casting long, twisting shadows in the moonlight. For a moment, everything was still. Then I saw him again. He was standing closer this time, near the patio steps. His face was obscured by shadow, but I could feel his eyes on me. I turned on the porch light. He was gone. The next day, I installed security cameras around the property. Emily teased me about being paranoid, but she didn't argue. That evening, as Mia played near the garden, she said something that made my stomach drop. "The man says hi." I crouched down beside her. "What man, Mia?" She pointed to the oak tree at the back of the yard, the one standing there. I followed her gaze. Nothing. That night, I watched the security feed until my eyes burned. At exactly 3:12 a.m., the screen flickered. When the image cleared, the man was there, standing outside the kitchen window. I ran downstairs, flashlight in hand, but when I reached the door, the yard was empty. By the third night, I was unraveling. I couldn't focus on work, and Emily was on edge, though she tried to hide it for Mia's sake. After dinner, I decided enough was enough. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the backyard.
Who are you?
I called into the darkness.
What do you want?
For a moment, there was only silence. Then, from the shadows near the oak tree, the man stepped forward. He was tall and thin, his skin pale and waxy like he hadn't seen sunlight in years. His clothes were outdated, worn trousers and a button-up shirt that looked like they belonged to another era. "This is my home," he said, his voice low and hollow.
This house belongs to my family now.
I replied, though my voice wavered. "You need to leave." He stared at me for a long moment, unblinking. Then he took a step back into the shadows and vanished. The next morning, Emily and I went to the local records office. We needed answers. The house had belonged to a man named Richard Hayes, who disappeared in 1957. Neighbors reported seeing him digging in the backyard late at night, but when the police investigated, they found nothing. No body, no signs of foul play. He had simply vanished. The garden, as it turned out, had been an overgrown vegetable patch. Rumors swirled that Hayes had buried something or someone beneath it. That evening, I returned to the backyard alone. I stood by the oak tree, flashlight in hand, and called out.
Richard, if you're here, show yourself.
The air grew cold, and the shadows seemed to shift. Slowly, the man appeared, his expression blank.
I'm sorry.
I said, my voice trembling.
I don't know what happened to you, but you're scaring my family. Please, move on.
For a moment, he just stood there. Then, he raised a hand, pointing to the ground beneath the oak tree. The next day, I rented a shovel. What I found confirmed the rumors, an old, rusted box buried deep in the soil. Inside were personal items, a locket, letters, and a journal. The journal told the story of Richard Hayes and the woman he loved, who had died tragically in the house. The grief had consumed him, and he had buried her keepsakes, hoping to hold on to her memory. After I reburied the box and said a quiet prayer, the sightings stopped. The backyard felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. We still live in the house, but I never stay outside after dark. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear faint whispers near the garden, like a man and woman saying their final goodbyes. I've always been a cautious driver. With a wife and daughter in the back seat, you learn to be. But no amount of careful driving could have prepared me for what happened that night. It wasn't just another long drive home. It was something else. Something I still struggle to explain. It started like any other late-night trip. Sarah, my wife, and our 6-year-old daughter, Lily, had fallen asleep in the back while I kept my eyes on the narrow stretch of road ahead. We were returning from a family reunion, and exhaustion hung in the air. The clock on the dashboard glowed 11:37 p.m. The road ahead twisted through dense woods, silent and dark, with no signs of life for miles. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, just the three of us and the open road. That was until I rounded a bend, and something shot across the road. It happened so fast, I barely had time to react. A flash of pale, almost white skin darting from the trees. I hit the brakes hard. The car screeched, and then there was the sickening thud. We lurched forward, and the sudden stop jarred Sarah and Lily awake. "David, what was that?" Sarah's voice was laced with panic.
I don't know. A deer, maybe.
I muttered, more to reassure myself than her. Lily rubbed her eyes, still groggy. "Daddy, is it okay?" I glanced at her in the rearview mirror,
It's fine, sweetheart. Go back to sleep.
but I could tell she wouldn't. I put the car in park and grabbed the flashlight from the glove box.
I'll check it out.
As I stepped out, the cool night air greeted me, but there was something odd about it. It felt thick, almost like I was stepping into water. The forest lining the road was deathly still. Not a single cricket chirped. I walked to the front of the car, flashlight beam cutting through the dark. The bumper was dented, smeared with a dark substance that looked too thick to be blood. I followed the faint trail about 10 yards down the road until I saw it. A deer lay in the middle of the road. But something was wrong. Its legs were twisted unnaturally, bent backward as if it had been dropped from a great height. I moved closer, stomach tightening. The deer's head suddenly snapped up, and I froze. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, but they weren't the eyes of an animal. They were hollow, empty, and far too human. It opened its mouth and let out a wail that didn't belong in this world. High-pitched, almost desperate. I stumbled back, barely able to keep hold of the flashlight. The creature scrambled to its feet, limbs bending unnaturally, and bolted into the woods, disappearing into the trees. Heart pounding, I hurried back to the car. "David?" Sarah called out. Her voice sounded small, frightened.
I don't know what I just saw,
I said, climbing back into the driver's seat.
but we're not staying here.
I twisted the key in the ignition, but the car sputtered and died. I tried again. Nothing. Sarah and Lily huddled closer in the back. "Is it broken?" Sarah asked.
The radiator might be damaged.
I leaned back in my seat, gripping the wheel.
I'll check under the hood.
As I stepped out again, the uneasy feeling returned. The flashlight flickered. I tapped it, and it steadied, but my hand wouldn't stop shaking. Under the hood, everything looked fine. No leaks, nothing obvious, but the car wouldn't start. I slammed the hood shut. "Daddy," Lily's voice trembled from the back seat. "There's someone in the woods." I spun around, scanning the tree line. I didn't see anyone, but the shadows seemed to shift unnaturally.
Stay in the car.
I said, more forcefully than I intended. Sarah opened her door slightly. "David, I don't think we should stay here. Can we call someone?" I pulled out my phone. No signal. Of course. Then from the trees, a low growl echoed. I turned sharply. A tall figure stepped just to the edge of the woods. At first, I thought it was a person, but as it moved forward, I realized it wasn't. Its limbs were too long, skin stretched pale and tight over its bones. Its face, dear God, its face, looked like the deer I hit, distorted wrong. It cocked its head, mimicking my stance. Then it spoke, in Lily's voice. "Daddy, what's wrong?" Every hair on my body stood on end. Sarah screamed, "Get back in the car!" I yanked the driver's side door open and jumped in, locking it behind me. The figure lingered outside the car, just beyond the headlights. More shapes emerged from the woods, pale, twisted figures with hollow eyes. They circled the car, dragging their limbs along the ground. One pressed its face against the window, skin stretched so thin I could see the bones beneath. I twisted the key in desperation. The engine sputtered, and for a moment I thought it wouldn't start, but it roared to life. I slammed on the gas. The creatures scattered as we tore down the road. In the rearview mirror, the figures stood at the edge of the woods, watching, until the trees swallowed them whole. A few miles ahead, a gas station appeared like a beacon. I pulled in, shaking. An old man behind the counter looked up as I entered. He didn't ask why I looked so pale. "You saw them, didn't you?" he said quietly. "You're lucky. Most don't make it past the hollow road."